In the year 2347, humanity was nothing more than a whisper in a galaxy full of thunder. The Galactic Concord had existed for over 60,000 years, a massive alliance of more than 4,000 alien species, all bound together under the iron rule of the Vilthari Empire. A civilization of towering reptilian beings who believed they had been born to rule the stars, and who had spent millennia making sure no one forgot it. Humanity had joined the Concord 130 years ago, back when the first human ships had stumbled beyond the edge of their own solar system, and found a universe that was already claimed, already ordered, and already tired of newcomers. They were given a designation, Class 7 Primitive Civilization, and told to be grateful for it. They were allowed 14 colony worlds, a small cluster of planets surrounding Earth, and they were told very clearly that they would expand no further, that the stars beyond their little corner were off limits. Of space belonged to older and greater peoples, and that if they behaved themselves, they would be tolerated. Most species in the Concord accepted their place without complaint, because the alternative was annihilation, and the Vilthari had demonstrated many times over the centuries that they were very good at annihilation. Humanity accepted too, or at least, that is what it looked like from the outside. Ambassador Alara Voss had served as humanity's voice in the Concord for 12 years, and in all that time she had never once been treated as an equal. She was a tall woman with dark skin and sharp eyes, and a calm voice that never wavered, even when the delegates of 1,000 worlds laughed at her proposals or ignored her completely, even when the Vilthari representative called her people the short-lived ones, and suggested that a species that barely lasted a century had no business making demands about the future. She sat in the grand chamber of the Concord on the station called Aethys Prime, surrounded by beings who had lived for thousands of years, beings with scales and wings and tentacles and forms that human eyes still struggled to understand. And she made her case with the same patience she had shown every single time before. The people of Earth and her colonies request an expansion of colonization rights, she said, her voice steady and clear across the vast chamber. We have met every requirement, followed every protocol, and fulfilled every obligation placed upon us by the Concord for over a century, and we believe the time has come for our borders to grow. The chamber was quiet for a moment, and then the laughter started. It was not loud or cruel in the way a human might laugh. It was worse than that, because it was dismissive, the sound of 4,000 civilizations looking at a child who had asked to sit at the adult table. The Vilthari High Speaker, a massive reptilian figure draped in robes of liquid silver, leaned forward and spoke in a voice like grinding stone. The short-lived ones are ambitious, he said, and the translator units carried his amusement to every corner of the room. Perhaps in another 1,000 years, when your species has proven it can endure, we will revisit this request. Alara did not flinch. She did not argue. She simply bowed her head in the way the Concord expected and returned to her seat. And if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed that her hands were shaking, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. She returned to Earth 3 days later and stood before the United Terran Council in the deep underground chamber beneath Geneva, where humanity's real leaders met, far from the eyes and ears of the Concord surveillance networks. The council was made up of 30 men and women who represented every nation and colony in the Terran sphere, and they listened in silence as Alara told them what had happened. They will never give us room to grow, she said, and her voice was different now, harder and colder than the one she used in the Grand Chamber. They see us as insects, as a nuisance to be managed, and one day, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but one day, they will decide that managing us is too much trouble, and they will do to us what they have done to every other species that became inconvenient. Chancellor Idris Okonkwo sat at the head of the long table, a broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples, and a stillness about him that made people listen when he spoke. and he let the silence hold for a long moment before he asked the question that everyone in the room was already thinking. How are the furnaces? General Anya Reyes, commander of the Terran Defense Initiative, answered without hesitation. All 14 worlds report full readiness, Chancellor. The orbital platforms are dormant but operational, calibrated and waiting, and the shipyards have been producing at shadow capacity for the last 31 years. She paused and looked around the room. We currently have 2,812 combat-capable warships distributed across hidden docks in every system we control, along with drone swarms, cyber warfare suites, and special forces units that have been training for exactly this scenario since before most of the people in this room were born. The room was still. It was a staggering number, because the Concorde's intelligence services estimated that humanity possessed no more than 40 warships, a small and pitiful defense fleet befitting a Class 7 species. And humanity had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it that way, hiding their ships in asteroid fields and hollow moons and the dark spaces between stars where no one ever looked. This was the secret that burned at the heart of human civilization, that for over a century, while they smiled and bowed and accepted every insult, they had been building, always building, because humanity had learned a lesson long before it ever reached the stars, a lesson written in blood across thousands of years of their own history. The lesson was simple. Peace is a gift, but survival is a choice, and the only species that survives is the one that is ready to fight when the gift is taken away. Chancellor Okonkwo looked at Alara, and something passed between them, an understanding that needed no words. We are not going to start a war, he said quietly, but when they come for us, and they will come, we will be ready, and we will show them what it means to push a species that has spent its entire existence learning how to survive against impossible odds. Alara nodded. They think we are short-lived, she said. They think that makes us weak, but they have it backwards. We are short-lived, and that is exactly why every single one of us fights like. There is no tomorrow, because for us, there never is. Far above them, in the cold silence of space, the Velthari Empire continued to turn its ancient gaze across the galaxy, confident in its power, certain of its supremacy, utterly unaware that the smallest and youngest species in its domain had already decided that if the day ever came, they would not go quietly. And on a world called New Geneva, in the Kepler 442 system, a school full of children was practicing a music recital, their voices rising sweet and bright into the evening air, completely unaware that in 6 months their world would burn, and their song would become the battle cry of a species that the galaxy had badly underestimated. The stars were quiet, but the silence was not peace. It was a held breath, and somewhere in the dark, humanity was waiting. 6 months after the Concorde Summit, the order came down from the golden throne of Velthari Prime, like a blade falling in the dark. They called it Concorde Directive 4 Omega, a population correction mandate authorized by Emperor Draelkith the Eternal himself, a being who had ruled the galaxy for 9,000 years, and who had never once doubted that his word was law. The directive named only one species, humanity. It stated in cold and careful language that the human population had grown beyond sustainable levels, that their 14 colony worlds were consuming resources at an unacceptable rate, and that for the stability of the Concorde, 4 of those worlds would be subjected to managed depopulation, which was the Empire's polite way of saying forced sterilization and mass relocation. The real reason had nothing to do with resources. Draelkith's intelligence advisors had finally noticed what no one else in the galaxy had bothered to look for. Unusual energy signatures hidden in asteroid belts, the shipyard activity buried deep inside hollow moons, the strange fact that humanity was the only species in the entire Concorde that had never stopped manufacturing weapons of war. Not even for a single year, not even in peacetime. "They are building something," the chief advisor had warned, his scales rippling with unease. "We do not yet know what, but we recommend immediate reduction of their capacity, before it becomes a concern." Drillkith had waved one clawed hand and signed the directive without a second thought, because in 60,000 years, no species had ever resisted a correction order, and he saw no reason why the short-lived ones would be any different. The Concorde fleet arrived in the Kepler 442 system on a Tuesday morning by Earth's calendar. 200 Vialthari warships, escorted by dozens of auxiliary vessels crewed by vassal species, who had no choice but to follow orders. Warning: they did not open negotiations, they simply opened fire. The colony world of New Geneva was a green and beautiful place, a world of rolling hills and silver rivers, and cities built with the kind of hope that only humans seemed to carry with them wherever they went. And in the space of 20 minutes, it became a graveyard. The orbital bombardments struck the capital city first, and then the industrial districts, and then the residential zones. And the Vialthari gunners did not distinguish between factories and hospitals, between military installations and schools. 32,000 people died in the first wave. Among them were the children of the Westfield Academy, who had been in the middle of their spring music recital when the ceiling above them turned to fire, their last song cut short mid-note, their voices silenced forever, broadcast live across every human world because the school had been streaming the performance for the families who could not attend. Every human being with a screen saw it happen. Every human being heard the music stop. And something broke inside the species that day, not their spirit, not their will, but the last thin thread of patience that had kept them smiling and bowing and accepting their place for over a century. On Earth, the United Terran Council convened within the hour, in the deep chamber beneath Geneva, and the footage from New Geneva played on every screen in the room, and no one spoke, because there were no words for what they were watching. Chancellor Idris Okonkwo stood at the head of the table, and for a long moment he simply looked at the faces of the men and women around him. The grief, the rage, the terrible stillness that comes when sorrow and fury meet and become something harder than either one alone. Then he spoke, and his voice was quiet, and it carried the weight of a species that had finally reached its limit. Close every border. Wake the furnaces. 7 words, and they changed the galaxy forever. Across 14 worlds, the signal went out simultaneously on encrypted channels that the Vialthari had never known existed, and what happened next was something the galaxy had never seen and would never forget. On Earth, the mountains of the Himalayas split open, and massive orbital defense platforms rose from hidden bunkers, carved into the bedrock. Platforms armed with weapons that human engineers had spent decades perfecting in secret. On the colony world of Titan's Reach, the asteroid belt that surrounded the system came alive as thousands of dormant weapons arrays powered up and filled the darkness with targeting solutions. On every single one of humanity's 14 worlds, the same thing happened. Hidden shipyards opened their doors, silent forges roared to life, and warships that had been waiting in the shadows for 30 years lit their engines and rose into the void like a swarm of angry stars. 2,812 warships. The Vialthari had estimated 40. When the full scope of the activation reached the intelligence stations of the Concorde, there was panic. Real, genuine panic of the kind that had not been felt in the halls of the Empire for millennia. "That is impossible," the Vialthari intelligence chief said, as the numbers scrolled across his displays. "No Class 7 species could build a fleet of that size without detection. Our surveillance systems cover every inhabited world in the Concorde." But humanity had not built their fleet on inhabited worlds. They had built it in the dark places, in the gaps between stars, in the abandoned moons and dead systems where no one ever looked. Because humans had learned long ago that the best weapon is the one your enemy does not know about. Ambassador Alara Voss delivered humanity's formal response to the Concorde from the bridge of the warship. UTS Defiance, and her face was calm, and her eyes were dry, and her voice did not waver as she spoke words that were broadcast to every species in the galaxy. 130 years ago, humanity joined the Galactic Concorde in good faith. We followed your laws, we accepted your restrictions, we endured your contempt, and we asked only to be treated as equals. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was iron. Today, you murdered 32,000 of our people, including children whose only crime was singing. You crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, and so we are done asking, we are done bowing, and we are done pretending that your empire has any authority over us. The United Terran Council hereby declares a state of total war against the Veilthari Empire, and formally withdraws from the Galactic Concorde. From this moment forward, any Veilthari vessel that enters human space will be destroyed. Any Concorde directive issued against our people will be ignored, and any force sent against us will be met with everything we have. You called us the short-lived ones. You were right, and that is exactly why we have no time for mercy, no patience for tyranny, and no fear of death. You should have left us alone. The transmission ended, and across the galaxy, 4,000 species sat in stunned silence as they tried to understand what had just happened. The smallest and youngest civilization in the Concorde, the one they had laughed at and dismissed and forgotten, had just looked the most powerful empire in history in the eye and told it to go to war. On Veilthari Prime, Emperor Draelkith watched the recording 3 times, and for the first time in 9,000 years, he felt something cold settle in his chest that he did not recognize. His advisor leaned close and whispered, "Your eternity, what shall we do?" Draelkith straightened on his throne and let his ancient pride smother the unfamiliar. "Crush them," he said. "They are insects. This will be over in weeks." He was wrong. He was catastrophically, historically, devastatingly wrong, and the galaxy was about to find out just how badly the Veilthari Empire had miscalculated when it decided to cross the one line that humanity would never forgive. The galaxy expected humanity to die quickly. Every military analyst in the Concorde, every strategist on every world from the core systems to the outer rim, agreed on one simple truth. The Veilthari Empire had crushed rebellions from species far older and far more powerful than humans, and this little war would be no different. They gave humanity 2 weeks, maybe 3. On the 4th day, the Veilthari Second Fleet, 160 warships under the command of Admiral Sorthek, a veteran of 12 pacification campaigns, arrived in the Kepler 442 system to finish what the bombardment of New Geneva had started, and they expected to find a broken colony defended by a handful of desperate ships. What they found instead was Admiral Kira Tanaka. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with black hair pulled tight behind her head, and dark eyes that held a kind of focused calm that her crew had learned to recognize as the most dangerous version of leadership. Their commander, the version that had already decided exactly how the enemy was going to die. Tanaka had positioned the Terran First Fleet in a wide defensive arc around New Geneva. 400 warships, arranged in a formation that the Veilthari scanners read as a standard defensive posture. And Sorthek smiled when he saw it, because he had broken defensive lines 100 times before. He ordered his fleet forward in the classic Veilthari hammer formation, a massive wedge of heavy capital ships designed to punch through enemy lines with overwhelming firepower. And his gunners began charging their weapons as the distance closed. At exactly 12,000 kilometers, Tanaka gave a single command: execute Ghostfall, and the Veilthari learned what human war looked like. The entire Terran formation vanished, not destroyed, not scattered, but simply gone. As 400 ships executed simultaneous microjumps through faster-than-light space, disappearing from every scanner and every targeting system in the Velthari fleet. For 3 seconds, Sorthek's displays showed empty space, and in those 3 seconds, he felt the first flicker of something he had never experienced in combat: confusion. Then the Terran ships reappeared inside his formation, not in front of it, not around it, but inside it, between his ships, beside his ships, above and below his ships, so close that the Velthari point defense systems could not fire without hitting their own vessels. The humans opened fire at point-blank range, and the Velthari Second Fleet came apart like glass struck by a hammer. It was over in 11 hours. 160 Velthari warships destroyed, with only 23 Terran ships lost, and when the surviving Velthari escape pods were recovered, the officers inside them could not explain what had happened, because nothing in 60,000 years of galactic warfare had prepared them for it. Admiral Sorthek, pulled from the wreckage of his flagship, said only one thing to his captors before he fell silent forever. It was like fighting smoke. The Battle of Kepler 442 sent a shockwave through the galaxy. But it was only the beginning, because humanity did not pause to celebrate, did not stop to negotiate, did not give the Empire a single moment to recover. Within days of the victory, Terran cyber warfare units launched what would later be called the Blackout Campaign, a coordinated assault on the Velthari communication relay network that spanned the entire Empire. The Velthari had used the same communication system for 40,000 years, a vast web of quantum-linked relay stations that allowed instant contact between any 2 points in their territory, and they had never bothered to upgrade its security because no species had ever been foolish enough to attack it. Human hackers did not just attack it, they dissected it, working from hidden stations scattered across human space. Teams of cyber specialists found vulnerabilities that the Velthari did not even know existed. Back doors left open by ancient programmers, protocols that had never been updated, encryption that had been state-of-the-art 10,000 years ago, but was laughably primitive by human standards. One by one, the relay stations went dark. For the first time in 60,000 years, the Velthari Empire experienced silence. Fleets could not contact their command, governors could not reach the capital, and the vast machinery of imperial control ground to a halt as the nervous system of the Empire was severed piece by piece. Panic spread faster than the blackout itself, because a civilization that had never known disconnection did not know how to function without it. And in the chaos that followed, humanity struck again and again, appearing from nowhere, hitting hard, and vanishing before the Velthari could organize a. But it was the ghosts of Titan that truly terrified the galaxy. The Velthari, like every species in the Concord, fought their wars at a distance, with massive ships exchanging fire across thousands of kilometers of empty space. And the idea of physically boarding an enemy vessel was considered not just tactically insane, but morally repulsive, a barbaric relic of primitive warfare that no civilized species would ever consider. Humanity considered it standard operating procedure. The Terran Special Operations Command deployed teams of soldiers in light assault craft, small, fast, and nearly invisible to sensors, that latched onto Velthari capital ships like parasites and cut their way inside. What happened next was the stuff of nightmares for species that had never experienced close-quarters combat. Human soldiers moved through the corridors of Velthari warships with a speed and violence that defied everything the galaxy knew about warfare. They fought in zero gravity, in darkness, in the smoke and chaos of burning compartments, and they did it with a ferocity that left the Velthari crews frozen with a terror they had no name for. A captured Velthari officer described the experience in a testimony that was later broadcast across the Concord. "They came through the walls," he said, his voice shaking. "They were small, so much smaller than us, but they moved like predators, like something that had been hunting in the dark for 1,000,000 years. We fired our weapons, and some of them fell, but the others did not stop. They never stopped, and when they reached us, they fought with their hands, and their blades, and their teeth. And I understood then that these creatures were not civilized beings playing at war. They were something else entirely, something the galaxy forgot could exist. On Vaelthari Prime, Emperor Draelkith received the reports from the front with growing disbelief. Second Fleet, the Blackout Campaign, the boarding actions, each one a blow that no species had ever dealt to the Empire before. Each one proof that the short-lived ones were something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. He ordered 5,000 additional warships to the front, pulling them from garrison duties across the Empire, and his advisors assured him that this would be more than enough to overwhelm humanity's defenses. But even as the Emperor marshaled his forces, something else was happening in the quieter corners of the galaxy. Something that would prove just as important as any battle. The Chelrani Confederation, an insectoid species that had served as Vaelthari vassals for 8,000 years, made secret contact with human diplomats through channels so deeply encrypted that even the Vaelthari blackout could not touch them. "We have watched what you are doing," the Chelrani envoy said, her compound eyes glittering in the low light. "Hidden meeting room. We have served the Empire for longer than your species has existed, and in all that time, we have never seen anyone fight them and survive. Tell us, humans, do you truly believe you can win this war?" The human diplomat, a young man named David Chen, who had been a schoolteacher before the war, and who still carried the grief of New Geneva in his eyes, looked at the Chelrani envoy, and answered with a simplicity that she would later say changed her entire understanding of the universe. "We do not have a choice," he said. "They killed our children, and we are a species that will burn the galaxy to ash before we let that go unanswered. So yes, we believe we can win, because the alternative is something we refuse to accept." The Chelrani envoy was quiet for a long time. Then she leaned forward and said, "Tell us how we can help." And in that moment, the war stopped being humanity against the Empire and became something much larger. In the foundation of a 60,000-year-old order that was about to split wide open. By the 4th month of the war, the Vaelthari Empire was bleeding from wounds it did not know how to heal. No one in the galaxy could quite believe what was happening, because empires like the Vaelthari were not supposed to bleed. They were supposed to crush and conquer and endure, the way they had for 60,000 years, the way everyone assumed they always would. But humanity had not read the rules, and even if they had, they would not have cared. The Terran fleets pushed beyond the borders of human space for the first time in history, and wherever they went, they did something that shocked the galaxy far more than any weapon or battle tactic. They asked. On every world they liberated from Vaelthari control, the first thing the human commanders did was land a small team, find the local leaders, and ask a single question. What do you want? Not, what can you give us? Not swear loyalty to humanity. Just, what do you want? Simple thing, and yet no one in the Concord had ever done it before. Because the Vaelthari model of governance was built on obedience, not consent. And the idea that a liberating force would actually care about the wishes of the liberated was so foreign that most species did not know how to respond. But they learned quickly, and what they wanted was freedom. The Chelrani Confederation was the first to formally break from the Concord, announcing their alliance with humanity in a declaration that was broadcast across every communication channel that was still functioning after the Blackout campaign. Then came the Drovani Collective, an aquatic species that had been subjugated for 12,000 years and who had been quietly dreaming of rebellion for every single one of them. Then the Vorath, the Kinshi, the Pauline, species after species stepping out of the Empire's shadow and into the light, drawn not by humanity's military power, but by something far more compelling. The radical and terrifying idea that maybe, just maybe, the galaxy did not have to be ruled by fear. The Concord fractured, and Emperor Draelkith watched it happen from his throne with a fury that burned so hot it almost looked like calm. He ordered the siege of Valthari Prime's outer ring to be held at all costs, because the outer ring was the industrial heart of the Empire. Vast orbital stations and factory worlds that produced the ships and weapons that had maintained Valthari supremacy since before most species had learned to use fire. Admiral Kira Tanaka led the assault, and it was the most brutal engagement of the war. The battle lasted 6 weeks, and during those 6 weeks, the void around Valthari Prime's outer ring became a graveyard of broken ships and burning metal that stretched across millions of kilometers. The Valthari fought with everything they had, their best ships, their most experienced commanders, their most advanced weapons, and they killed humans by the thousands, shattering Terran warships and filling the darkness with debris and death. And humanity kept coming. A captured Valthari officer, one of the few survivors of the Outer Ring's defense fleet, gave a testimony that was later shared across the galaxy, and that became one of the most famous statements of the entire war. "We killed them by the thousands," he said, and his voice was hollow with something that was not anger or hatred, but a deep and bewildered exhaustion. "We destroyed their ships. We broke their formations. We did everything right. And they mourned their dead. They wept for their fallen. And then they came again and again and again. Tell me, what do you do with an enemy that grieves and still fights? What do you do with a species that loves its people so much that it will walk through fire to avenge them?" He had no answer, and neither did the Empire. The Outer Ring fell, and with it fell the Valthari's ability to replace their losses at the rate the war demanded. On Earth and across every human colony, the full scale of humanity's industrial capacity was now on display for the galaxy to see, and it was a sight that defied every model and every estimate the Valthari had ever produced. Ships, drones, weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, food, everything a war machine needed poured out of human factories at a rate that seems physically impossible. Because humanity had not switched to a war economy when the fighting started. Their economy had always been a war economy. For over a century, while they smiled and bowed and played the part of the obedient minor species, every human factory, every shipyard, every research lab had been designed with dual purpose, civilian production on the surface and military production underneath, so deeply integrated that you could not separate one from the other without dismantling the entire civilization. A Valthari analyst, studying the production figures with growing horror, wrote a report that was later found in the ruins of an Imperial intelligence station. "We assumed they were primitives who had stumbled into a war they could not win," the report read. "We were wrong. They did not stumble into anything. They were preparing for this from the moment they joined the Concord. They built their entire civilization around the possibility that one day they would have to fight for survival. And everything they showed us, the small fleet, the limited industry, the cooperative attitude, was a mask. And behind the mask was something we should have recognized, because it is the same thing we see when we look in our own mirror: a predator." Emperor Draelkith, desperate and enraged and running out of options, made the decision that would define the final chapter of the war. He authorized the deployment of the Omega Lances. The Omega Lances were planet-killing weapons, massive orbital platforms capable of cracking a world's crust and rendering it uninhabitable. And the Empire had held them in reserve for 40,000 years, a final deterrent that had never been used, because the mere threat of their existence had always been enough. Draelkith aimed them at Earth. He assembled a fleet of 3,000 warships to escort the Omega Lance platforms to the Sol system, and he gave the order with a coldness that even his own advisors found unsettling. "If we cannot control them," he said, "then we will erase them. and let the galaxy remember what happens to those who defy the eternal throne. The fleet launched, and every species in the galaxy held its breath, because if the Omega Lances reached Earth, there would be nothing left of humanity but ash and memory. The combined human and allied armada met them at the edge of the Sol system, in what would become known as the Battle of the Threshold, the largest naval engagement in the recorded history of the galaxy. 20,000 ships on each side, filling the space between Mars and Jupiter with a storm of light and fire and death that could be seen from Earth's surface as a second sun burning in the night sky. The battle raged for 3 days, and in those 3 days, more ships were destroyed than in the previous 10 months of war combined. And the losses on both sides were staggering, catastrophic, the kind of numbers that would haunt both species for generations. But humanity held. They held because they were fighting for their home, for the blue world that had given birth to their species, for every memory and every dream and every child who had ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. Hours of the battle. When the Veilthari Command Dreadnought broke through the Terran lines and made a direct run at Earth with 2 Omega Lance platforms in tow, the flagship UTS New Geneva, named for the world that had been burned, crewed by survivors of that burning, turned to intercept. Captain Yuki Tanaka, Admiral Kira Tanaka's own daughter, commanded the New Geneva, and she knew that her ship was too damaged to win a conventional engagement with the Dreadnought. And she knew that if the Dreadnought reached Earth, it would be the end of everything. She opened a channel to her mother and said simply, "I am sorry and I love you, and tell them we did not go quietly." Then she ordered ramming speed. The UTS New Geneva struck the Veilthari Command Dreadnought at full velocity, and both ships ceased to exist in a flash of light so bright that it blinded sensors across the entire system. And the Omega Lance platforms, deprived of their escort and their command ship, were destroyed by the Allied fleet within the hour. The Battle of the Threshold was over. Humanity had won, but the cost was beyond counting. And when the light faded and the debris settled, the survivors on both sides looked out at the graveyard of ships that stretched across the solar system, and understood that the galaxy would never be the same. Admiral Kira Tanaka stood on the bridge of her own ship, looking at the place where her daughter's ship had been, and she did not weep, because there would be time for weeping later. Right now, there was a war to end. The war ended not with a roar, but with a silence so deep that the entire galaxy seemed to hold its breath. 14 months of total war. 14 months of battles and blood and fire and sacrifice. And then, between one heartbeat and the next, it was over. Emperor Draelkith the Eternal, 9,000 years old and undefeated until the day he met humanity, sat on his golden throne on Veilthari Prime and stared at the reports that his remaining advisors placed before him with trembling hands. The Omega Lance fleet was destroyed, the outer industrial ring was lost, the Concord had fractured beyond repair, with more than half of its member species either openly allied with humanity or refusing to answer Imperial summons. And the Terran Allied Armada was now within striking distance of the Veilthari home system itself. For the first time in his impossibly long life, Draelkith looked at the future and saw something other than his own dominion stretching endlessly forward, and the thing he saw frightened him more than any enemy fleet. He saw irrelevance. He sent the ceasefire request at dawn, and humanity accepted it within the hour. The terms would be negotiated on Veilthari Prime itself, because Chancellor Idris Okonkwo insisted on it, not as a humiliation, but because he wanted the Emperor to see the face of the species he had tried to erase, to look into human eyes and understand what he had awoken. Okonkwo arrived on Veilthari Prime aboard a single transport ship, escorted by a honor guard of just 12 soldiers. a deliberate choice that was not lost on the Vaelthari, who had expected the humans to arrive with an armada at their backs and conquest in their hearts. He walked through the great halls of the imperial palace, a structure so vast and so ancient that it made the pyramids of Egypt look like children's toys. And he walked with the steady stride of a man who was tired beyond measure, carried something in his chest that was stronger than exhaustion. The throne room was a cathedral of black stone and golden light, and Draelkith sat upon his throne like a monument to an age that was ending, his massive reptilian form draped in the silver robes of his office, his ancient eyes watching the small human approach with a mixture of hatred and something that, if he had been capable of admitting it, might have been respect. Nothing like what he had expected. The Sol Accords did not demand tribute. They did not claim Vaelthari territory. They did not impose the kind of crushing punishment that the Empire itself had inflicted on defeated species for 60,000 years. Instead, the Accords laid out something that had never existed in the history of the galaxy, a framework for equality. The Vaelthari Empire would be dissolved, not as a punishment, but as a recognition that no single species had the right to rule all others. Every vassal species would be granted full and unconditional sovereignty over their own worlds and their own futures. A new governing body would be established, the Assembly of Free Peoples, with equal representation for every species, regardless of how old or how powerful they were. One voice per civilization, no exceptions. The use of population correction directives would be declared a crime against sentient life, punishable by the collective. Intervention of the entire assembly, so that no species would ever again face what humanity had faced on New Geneva. And humanity, the species that had fought the war, that had bled and burned and sacrificed more than any other, claimed nothing for itself beyond its original 14 worlds and the systems it had liberated. Draelkith looked up from the document, and for the first time in 9,000 years, the Emperor of the Galaxy did not know what to say. "You could take everything," he said finally, his voice quiet and stripped of its usual grandeur. "Your fleets are at my doorstep. Your allies would support you. You could claim this empire for your own and rule as I have ruled, and no one would stop you." He leaned forward, and his ancient eyes searched Okonkwo's face for something he could understand. "Why do you not take what you have earned?" Okonkwo looked at the Emperor, and there was no triumph in his expression. Satisfaction. There was only a bone-deep weariness. And something else, something that Draelkith's translators could not quite capture, but that the humans in the room recognized immediately. It was grief. Grief for the dead of New Geneva, for Captain Yuki Tanaka and her crew, for every man and woman and child who had been lost in the 14 months of fire that had brought them to this moment. "Because Empire is what we fought against," Okonkwo said, and his voice was steady, even though his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We did not go to war for conquest. We went to war because you killed our children and expected us to accept it. We are not you, more than our ships and our soldiers and our weapons. That is why we won." The room was silent. Draelkith stared at the human for a long time, and something shifted behind his ancient eyes. Not agreement, not yet, but the first crack in a worldview that had been built over millennia, of understanding that perhaps strength did not have to mean dominion. He signed the Sol Accords. The news spread across the galaxy like light from a newborn star, carried by every communication channel that humanity's engineers had rebuilt after the Blackout campaign, reaching every world and every species that had spent millennia living under the shadow of an empire that had told them their place was to serve. The Vaelthari people themselves were not punished. Their military was restructured. Their imperial government was dissolved, but their worlds remained their own, and their culture was left intact. Because the Sol Accords were not about vengeance, they were about building something new. And in the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Many Veilthari, freed from the rigid hierarchy that had defined their civilization for 60,000 years, began to speak openly about the relief they felt, about the weight that had been lifted. Turned out that empires are prisons for the rulers too, and even the species that held the whip had grown tired of the endless cycle of conquest and control. The Assembly of Free Peoples held its first session on a newly constructed space station orbiting the star that humans called Alpha Centauri, a neutral point between Earth and the wider galaxy. And representatives from over 2,000 species gathered in a chamber that had been designed with a single principle in mind. No seat was higher than any other. Ambassador Elara Voss, the woman who had been laughed at in the Concord, who had been called a representative of insects, who had spent 12 years enduring contempt with a patience that had been mistaken for weakness, was nominated for the position of first president of the Assembly. The vote was unanimous. Every species, including the Valthari, cast their voice in her favor, because she had become something that the galaxy had never had before. Symbol of what it looked like when power was held by someone who did not want it for its own sake. Elara stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, human and alien, old and young, predator and prey, conqueror and conquered, all of them gathered together in the same room as equals for the first time in the history of the galaxy. She thought of New Geneva, of the children whose song had been silenced, of the war that had cost so many lives, of the long and painful road that had brought them all to this moment. And then she spoke, and her voice carried across the stars. For 60,000 years, the galaxy was told that order required obedience, that peace required submission, and that the strong had the right to decide the fate of the weak. Today we reject that lie, not with anger and not with hatred, but with a simple truth that my species learned long ago on a small blue world orbiting an ordinary star. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion but clear as a bell. The truth is this: we are stronger together than any empire could ever be alone. And the measure of a civilization is not how much power it holds, but how it treats those who have none. She looked across the chamber, at the Chelrani and the Drovani, at the Vorath and the Kinshi, at the Veilthari delegates who sat among their former subjects as equals for the first time, and she smiled. And it was a smile that carried the weight of everything humanity had endured, and everything they had chosen not to become. We are no longer subjects of an empire. We are neighbors. And from this day forward, no one stands alone. The chamber erupted, not with the laughter that had greeted her the last time she had spoken before the assembled species of the galaxy, but with something else entirely. A sound that rose from 2,000 delegations and filled the station and spilled out into the void and echoed across the end. Stars. It was applause. And somewhere, in a frequency that only humans could hear, carried on the solar wind from a world called New Geneva that was already being rebuilt, there was another sound, faint and sweet and unbroken.